Herrera, and I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Language and Linguistics. So mine's going to be a little bit different because the purpose of my talk is for a different audience, and I'll get into that in a second. So I was asked to submit a proposal for a speaking engagement, which later they selected me, and the proposal is for a group of engineers. I'm not an engineer, right? And it's an engineering firm, and they wanted to talk about diversity. And I said, okay, well that's interesting, I can talk about diversity. How do I talk about it to a group of engineers at a large engineering firm without sounding too much like a literature professor, right? Because the audience is different. So this is not so much an academic talk, number one. Number two, this talk is in October and I have a lot more work to do on it. This is just getting started. So when I submitted it, I called it the Mexican flyboy and the most beautiful word in the world. And I'll get into that in a bit. That's really going to be the second part of the talk. Today, for the actual talk that I'm going to give in October, it's called Navigating the Corporate World with a Cultural Compass. So I have to think about my audience and how do I, oftentimes conferences we read papers, sometimes we read papers, but I can't read a paper to them because I don't think that's going to go over well for an audience that wants to be more, that wants me to hopefully share something with them because there's not going to be a published paper necessarily. Since the keynote speech, it's about 40 minutes. So I have about 40 minutes to go to this material. So it's going to be a lot different when I actually get the final version. So they sent me, and engineers are very, they sent me a whole list of, can you talk about all these things? And there was about 20 items on there. And I said, yeah, I can talk about them all. But if I talk about all of that, I'll talk about nothing, right? And so that's the danger of that. And I said, let me reduce it to some of your main points here and what they want to get to. So you think of diversity, we talk about diversity at the university, but really corporations as well have to work with a number of issues of diversity, particularly when they're multinationals, particularly when it's something like an engineering firm, because now engineers are being hired from all over the world to work in one particular spot. So yeah, they know the engineering stuff, but they're having to work together on major programs and projects. And so there's a lot of cultural differences, language differences, different values. And so for them, this is important to us because we're having to work together, but we don't necessarily understand each other when it comes to outside the math, right? So they said, talk about these things. You know, what should Hispanics do to empower Hispanics, right? What to do to empower themselves? What should non-Hispanics do to empower Hispanics? What are some cultural differences between Hispanics and Anglo cultures that may cause issues in the workplace? How do we build cross-cultural collaboration/communication? What are some do's and do-nots regarding our Hispanic heritage? These are their questions. Like, can you talk about this for us? And I thought, okay, it's going to be challenging. How do I talk about this with engineers and yet do it from a place of strength for me? Because I don't want to go there and try to pretend to be an engineer or talk to them in ways that maybe make sense to them but don't make sense to me. So I had to think about this material and thought, well, how can I do this? And I think about my strengths. My strengths, I'm a literature professor, specifically Chicano literature, culture, and film. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to start with the cultural basis, and we're going to talk about culture. I'm really going to use this one novel, we'll see it in a bit, as sort of my main tool. So I'm going to restructure these slides before I get to that talk, more slides, and then the structure. But I do want to talk about what culture is for them, because we have an idea of what culture is. We talk about culture, we mention the word culture, cultural values, etc., corporate culture, all sorts of things. But do we really, how often do we really talk about culture specifically? And I just brought up some simple definitions, some are simple, a little more complex, to really talk about. If you want to talk about corporate culture, well, let's talk about culture first. Culture is a system of knowledge shared by a relatively large group of people. Okay, that makes sense, it's pretty general. This is the one that I really like. Culture refers to active, passive processes of sharing, teaching, and learning, acquiring. And this is where my background, not just as a Chicano literature professor, but as a language professor, when I thought about, sometimes we do actively teach things and we do actively learn things, but a lot of times with language, it's also passive things that you learn and things that you acquire, right? We talk about language acquisition. Some things you acquire because you see it over and over again. And I think culture is the same way. Sometimes our parents, our grandparents, community teaches us certain things. Other times we see it over and over again, and we see how important it is, it becomes a part of us. So knowledge, experiences, beliefs, values, attitudes, meanings, hierarchies, religion, those are all things we think about. But I like these other ones. Notions of time, roles, spatial relations, and concepts of the universe are really particularly like notions of time and spatial relations, and roles as well, but particularly in the workplace, because notions of time, engineers, and I think most people who are professionals understand deadlines. We understand it's due by Friday at 5. Now, whether we respect that deadline or not is another question, but we understand the deadline. But notions of time, when someone says, I need this soon, what does that mean, right? When we say in Spanish, if something's gonna happen, ahorita viene, what does that mean? Right, ahorita can mean pretty soon, next 5, 10 minutes. It can mean next week. In some cases, it feels like it can be a year or two, right?
We don't know the culture, right?
If you don't know the culture. So you really have to understand notions of time. And then also spatial relations, right? I think many of us have been in a situation where someone is right here and they feel fine with it and maybe you don't, right? I like, someone who studies culture, I like looking at people, how they sit in public spaces, and do they sit in the middle of a bench? In other words, there's not much room here for you on the left or right, or do they automatically sit on the left or the right and say, here's room for someone to sit next to me, right? Spatial relationships in workplaces, how do we share space? Really important. Culture is communication, communication is culture. How do we communicate our values and our ideas, our wants and desires, and what's important to us? So we have to kind of understand what culture is. And then the other aspect I want to get into is storytelling, right? Because I'm thinking, once again, how do I share these ideas of diversity with a group of engineers? And I'm going to talk about storytelling. And you think, okay, these are people who are probably on a computer, but I think that storytelling is important no matter where you live and work. So what is storytelling, and what does it do to fix it? What do they do? What do storytellers do? Storytellers are a structured way of looking at reality. Sounds pretty good. Stories allow us to connect with another person, which is one of the highest forms of social being for humans. At the heart of it is good storytelling. When I'm telling you a story and you're engaged in it, you match your brain waves to mine. And stories help us experience reality in a way that makes sense, that we can process and help us cope. Stories are how we live our lives. So how can I take these ideas and try to apply them to these engineers, especially in terms of diversity? And that's something we'll have to keep working on. So what are stories good for? We talked a little bit about what stories are, but what are they good for, other than just being entertaining? I put the first one here that I think is really important, to show how you empathize with someone. So I have a whole bag of stories. Sometimes I give the shortened version, sometimes I give the longer version. It just depends on the moment, right, and the connection you want to create. But me thinking as who I am as a professor, particularly of literature, but also particular language, I have several stories that I bring out of that bag depending on the moment. So when I was a TA, teaching assistant, like some of our graduate students here, and they expressed to me their concern of taking Spanish 200, 202, 212, whatever the number is, and jumping to 100, I think, oh, can I do it, right? Can I do 200? And I can sense their anxiety, I can sense their concern, and then I explain to them my experience as a heritage learner growing up around Spanish, but not necessarily speaking it or depending on with who. And then I help try to put them at ease with that and say, well, this is my experience and this is what I have seen. And then they start to calm down. Me as a new grad student, so when I meet with graduate students and they express to me their concern of the level of work, well, I might tell them my story as a new grad student, and I thought I was going to study literature. It turns out I was going to study half literature, half linguistics. My very first graduate class was with a linguistics professor. I'd never taken linguistics in my life. I'd never heard of it. And the very first words of that day were perifrástico and morfológico, and I thought, what are they talking about? Am I in the Klingon class? Are they speaking Klingon? But I got used to it, right? And so I told about my anxiety, and how I struggled my first semester, but how I kept working and I succeeded towards the end. If a student expresses to me their concern as a writer, or a friend, or a colleague, or they get their pick back from me and they say, what do I need to see? Am I really that bad? Well, I tell them my experience as a writer, right? And when I used to get papers back, when I got one time a comment back from my dissertation director, who was really well known in the field, everyone respected her, but she gave me very few comments. So as I'm going through my dissertation, awkward, nothing, and then all of a sudden it says, your transitions are shit. And I was like, okay, how do I handle that? I mean, she just went straight to it. But that's the way she was. But it doesn't mean that I shouldn't have been in the program. It doesn't mean that I wasn't qualified to get a PhD. It's just writing is a very difficult process. So then being as a professor, right? If I talk with a colleague and he or she expresses symptoms of imposter syndrome, right? Am I good enough, right? Are people questioning me? Then I tell them my story as my first year student when I felt didn't have enough support. And I was going to the classroom and really struggling with making sure that I was challenging and that they felt like I was qualified to be there, right? And so I get into these stories to tell, so I can empathize with someone, not just say, oh, I'm sorry, but to say, yeah, I know how that feels. Let me tell you what happened to me, and maybe that will help you. Teach them a lesson, you can tell stories, keep them from harm. Our parents and grandparents tell us something, tell us a story to keep us safe. Build communal institutional knowledge, right? When we start something for the first time, or we think, who were the first civilizations to start farming? Well, they just didn't make mistakes and hopefully didn't share the mistakes with someone, because then you can't really improve, right? If you had a lot of rain, what is the story about that rain? If you had a dry season, what's the story about that season? If you had infestation, what's the story of that? You need to share that story so your son, your daughter, next generation knows how to deal with it. Stories inform us to create forward relationships, right? Whether it's personal or professional, you have to have stories to form relationships and to make sense of our world. Anything that happens in the natural world, we have a story behind it, right? How did that begin? What's the mythology behind that? Because we want to understand it before the scientists come and explain it to us, right? We want to understand it for ourselves in our own way. So stories have a lot of different purposes. So for this talk, what I'm going to use as sort of a backdrop, as sort of my tool to talk about storytelling and diversity and collaborative work, right? Because that's one of the questions. How can we, what can we from diversity to work more collaborative in a positive, constructive way? I'm actually going to use a Chicano novel, right? Because that's my strength. It's The Mexican Flyboy by Alfredo Vea, University of Oklahoma Press, 2016. Some of my students have read it. I was fortunate to be an advanced reader for Oklahoma Press, so I read it before it came out to write a report if thumbs up or thumbs down or what needs to be fixed. And I'm kind of a slow reader. I'll read things over time, but I think I read this in 2 days because it was just fascinating. I thought, this is one of the best novels I've ever read, and I said, definitely have to publish it. If you don't, someone else will. Right? And I'm going to get into this a little bit. That's the cover. So, basic premise is Simon Vegas. There's a lot of narrative layers to the story. I'm not going to get into all of them. But while he's a soldier in Vietnam, he runs across this device. And he knows what it is when he first sees it, or he thinks he knows what it is. And it happens to be what's called the Antikythera mechanism, or Antikythera device. And it's an ancient Greek, one of the first computers, if you will, that was an engineering mechanism that was designed to predict astronomical positions and eclipses for calendar and astrological purposes decades in advance. So when I was thinking, how do I connect to a bunch of engineers through literature, I thought, perfect, I've got the perfect novel for it. It's about an engineering feat, right? And it happens to be some engineers in the novel. And they're not just, geeking it out and messing with this thing. They're doing things with it. They're working together. So you can see a fragment of it that was found, how big it is, and there's a virtual model of the Antikythera mechanism. So what can this novel, literature, storytelling, help us with about culture and storytelling and diversity? I'm going to get into the diversity things in the main talk. I won't have time today, really, I don't think. But just to give you an idea of who's in the novel, what's going on, there's several more characters. Simon Vegas, he doesn't put an X on his name in the book, is a university professor, and he teaches literature, which which I love, and he's also a Vietnam veteran, and he finds this device, and instead of trying to sell it on eBay and become a millionaire, he knows this is a special machine, right? When you create something, whether there's an engineering mechanism or something else, you think, well, what can I use it for? And in the novel, we see that historically it's been used for a number of things, but many times as a weapon of mass destruction. People want to find out what's the power behind this machine and how can we use it to our advantage in warfare. And he realizes that instead of destroying lives, he can save lives, or at least save someone in their moment of distress. And so, with the help of an engineer, Hephaestus II, sort of this mad scientist engineer, he helps Simon re-engineer the device to make it work for their purposes. And what they do is basically, they fly through other dimensions, they fly through space, they fly through time, and they go and find these people who in their moments, and these are true historical people actually, they're true historical figures,